Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each of our talks is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so if you'd like to claim that credit, just keep track of the talks that you attend for your records. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation today. If you're watching on our school's YouTube or Facebook pages, just enter your questions in the chat or the comment space at any point during the presentation, and we'll get through as many as we can. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Chris Adamo. Chris is Vice President at Danone North America for Federal and Industry Affairs, assisting the world's largest B Corp with strengthening the role of business in driving social and environmental good for all. Prior, Chris spent over a decade at the highest levels of the federal government, working on issues related to agriculture, environment, and nutrition. He served as the Chief of Staff for President Obama's White House Council on Environmental Quality from 2015 until the end of the administration in 2017, where he helped lead the president's agenda on climate change and conservation. From 2011 to 2015, he led the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry as its staff director for the negotiations and drafting of the 2014 Farm Bill, which included new opportunities for landscape scale conservation and unprecedented investment in healthy food. Chris began his Senate career in 2005 and was a legislative counsel in the U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow's office starting in 2007, where he worked on legislation such as the 2007 Energy Bill, the 2008 Farm Bill, the 2009 to 2010 Energy and Climate Bill efforts, as well as various other conservation initiatives. After serving in the Obama administration, Chris spent 2017 as a senior fellow at the National Wildlife Federation, advising on issues such as sustainable agriculture, climate change, natural resources, and water. And we're very pleased to claim that Chris is also an alum of Vermont Law School, a 2004 JD graduate. And I will go out on a limb and say that I bet, in addition to answering questions about the topic that he's discussing today, that Chris might be willing to entertain questions related to his extensive background in federal government and politics, to the extent that that is permitted, of course. I'll let him decide that. So Chris is here this summer co-teaching the course that we offer on the Farm Bill. And today his presentation is called ESG, Who's Making the Rules? Please join me in welcoming Chris Adamo.
Thank you, Jenny. And hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. It's a pleasure to be here. This is super exciting for me to take a stab at doing one of these lectures. I think they've been around for a number of years, probably going back to my time. And so I remember sitting in a few during my summer courses, which was now a little bit of a time ago. And so it's just a pleasure to be here to do this in conjunction with the course that I've been privileged to teach on agriculture and Farm Bill. So I will admit at the get-go here that a couple things. One, maybe caveats you might call this. First of all, ESG, for those of you who may be following this topic or maybe even new to this, it's a pretty new topic in a lot of ways, and it's a pretty nuanced topic. There's a spectrum of different issues that arise. And the other caveat I'll say is that I'm a practitioner of this world right now. And that's to say that I will be the first to admit that I'm learning daily on this topic. It's a subject that is evolving at rapid speed, and new issues, frankly, are popping up. New challenges are popping up on a daily, certainly annual basis. So it's an exciting place to be at. As Jenny mentioned, and I won't rehash my entire career, but I've been fortunate enough since graduating law school to have been in a few different areas of environmental policy, which is definitely my passion and where I've wanted to work my entire life. And, spent a good number of years working in Congress, helping write law and helping do oversight of law and policy on a number of different environmental issues and across the board. And, then got to go to the executive branch and help execute the law and administer the law in different ways, which was a real privilege and an exciting time for me. And then got to spend some time with some nonprofits over the years as well in different forms and facets. So I feel, for me, being at a company like Danone, which I promise not to do too much promotion here of my job or the company, but just for backdrop, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this towards the end. I believe, and it's one of the reasons I joined about 5 years ago, is one of the leading companies in trying to enact sustainability, trying to enact social good across its business operations as a core part of its business. And we'll talk more about that. And there's certainly other fantastic examples out there of companies trying to break the mold of what traditionally corporations are, both by law and in practice. So it's an exciting time to be in the business world right now. And so it's not static, it's super dynamic, and there's a lot happening, which hopefully we can cover today. So real quick, I'm going to put up some slides in just a minute. The purpose of this talk and what I tried to put together here is really a landscape of what I'm seeing as a practitioner inside a large company, and a lot of the various issues that are coming. Again, I don't think I'm going to provide a whole lot of answers to various issues, but hopefully what I'll be able to do is provide a bit of a spectrum, a bit of a landscape of the different things that are arising in terms of challenges to ESG efforts amongst companies and in the private sector, and then that intersection that is surfacing more and more with various types of law and policy, particularly here in the US, but certainly there's a global aspect of this as well, which I'll touch on a little bit, but primarily this is going to be from a US perspective. So let me put up those slides real quick. Of course, I'm not ready at the beginning. So please pay attention to the asterisk there. This is my talk. This is my effort that I've doing in my spare time. Luckily, my employer, Danone, is pretty gracious to let me be flexible and do things like this, including teach at Vermont. But I'm going to talk broadly here about ESG, and certainly don't want any assumptions that anything that I raise here today be attributed to my employer. So they're just my views, and I'm happy to address any of them both at the end of this talk and even offline. So we'll talk a little bit about this, just a quick overview of what I've set up here. The first point, what is ESG? We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Frankly, there's a lot of definitions out there. I think there's a lot of different ways to explain it, but we'll more get into the bullets after that about different frameworks that exist to govern ESG. Some of them are voluntary frameworks. Some of them are regulatory frameworks that are impacting ESG efforts, not necessarily guiding them entirely, but certainly impacting them in a number of different ways. I'm going to use climate change as an example. ESG is broad. It certainly can be attributed to almost any major environmental issue. A number of different social issues, as we'll talk about too. But I'm going to use climate is certainly one of the hot topics, no pun intended, apologies for that. And I think it's relevant in a number of ways to broadcast what I see as an emerging voluntary framework. And if it's, test me on this, but I often use the term quasi-governmental in many ways. And I think we can talk more about that. Governments, especially here in the US, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the federal level, courts are all starting to have some word or another on ESG efforts, and hopefully just be able to pinpoint a few of those different examples. And then it's definitely a political issue right now as well, in a number of ways. And this is, I think, probably not surprising. Any hot topic, I think, tends to have ebb and flow into the political arena. And certainly if we're going to make laws, then certainly by nature, it's going to be political. But there is some pushback on a number of sides of the aisle that we can talk about. And then hopefully we can open this up for a bit of discussion. Hopefully this slide is coming through clear enough. Sorry, the Zoom is being a little challenging for me. So I chose this graphic to break it down. We have 3 letters. We have 3 pillars of ESG frameworks. I'll also go so far as say that I don't love the term ESG. I think it's maybe it's just something that is too simplistic, or maybe there's a pretentiousness to it, I find at times, depending who's talking about and how it's being used. There's certainly other ways to talk about how companies are perhaps hopefully changing some of their course of business, and just what they're doing. I think there's a lot of layers to this. So I just want to, again, open to different ways to talk about it, but I think ESG is certainly the well-known way to think about it. But I think there's a number of ways, and I'll just say this out front. In the company I work with, I don't think we use it formally in any way. We tend to use a term, just Danone impact strategy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But lexicon aside, I think there's a couple things here that it's not, and a couple things that it is at a principle level. And these are my words. I didn't pull these from any study, any paper, although I think you'd find these trends and these issues in just about any reading out there. As I mentioned, there's a lot of ways to talk about ESG efforts and how companies are imparting new work towards the environment, new work on different social issues, and how it's governing itself along these different pathways. Arguably, there is definitely not one legal binding framework. There's definitely more voluntary frameworks coming into play in a number of ways, whether it's from the investor community or whether it's from nonprofits. There's a number of different reporting frameworks, disclosure frameworks, and rules that are starting to emerge, but most of it is either ad hoc, depending on the issue, say like climate change, or just not legally binding at all. Although that can be debated more and more, and we'll talk about that. Principle level, what ESG efforts should look like. First and foremost, I think the concept that this is not a static effort, right? Businesses are dynamic organizations, obviously, but through that core purpose of creating profit and doing whatever that business is designed to do, the ESG effort itself, or sustainability effort, impact effort, whatever it is you may call it, should be one that's constantly being tinkered with, constantly evolving, and frankly, and this gets to the second bullet, should be transparent. It should be fairly obvious what a company is doing from a strategic sense, what its impact is, whether on annual basis or otherwise. And certainly various documents that are out there, whether there's sustainability reports or various types of reporting for the investor community. It can look different ways, and we can certainly debate if they can be better, but there should be some degree of effort on being transparent. In some ways, and someone much more steeped in corporate law probably could say this better, there probably is some easier venues for if you're a publicly traded company. Just by nature, you're having to report a certain amount of transparency already. So tacking on to that may not be all that new, although it can be debated as to what you're tacking on. But if for a private company, we often, those of us on the outside of that private company may have a very difficult time seeing what's going on inside that entity. So ESG efforts, in theory, can offer a bit of an inside view of what a company is thinking, and also how they're imparting impact on these different stakeholders. And I chose my words carefully. It should be authentic and central to the core business purpose. Sometimes these sustainability reports and various ESG efforts, I think to the outsider, myself included, when I read about others, sometimes it can sound a little distant or maybe not fully, just not real enough. We need to know, I think, good ESG efforts, and I think companies are getting better at this. We're not perfect by any stretch, and there's certainly a range of different examples, but we should be real in our intent. And I think more and more this is becoming clear that it becomes very challenging to range too far outside what it is you do as a business. So for us as a food company, Danone, and I'm sorry I didn't describe Danone, but we are a multinational food company. We make a number of products. For us to start ranging outside of what food is or what nutrition is, I think becomes a challenge. And to be effective as both a company and towards our ESG efforts, we really need to think about how this integrates as a business, not something that's adjacent, not something that's an appendage, but something that's actually integrated and core to the business. And then I think one of the key piece here of all these efforts is that the business model that ultimately should be changing, or is changing one way or another, should be considering a broader stakeholder audience that's beyond the core shareholders of that business. Again, whether it's a public business or private business, how do you think about bringing in those broader stakeholders. And this is hard. There isn't a clear way to do this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just as an example, and this is a public graph. This is something that Danone uses, and we call it our Danone Impact Journey or Danone Impact Strategy. It mirrors pretty closely to the previous graphic of those 3 pillars. So environment, society, and governance. This is a little bit different, not quite 100% analogous, but for us as a food company, 2 critical pillars. One is the environment. Where do we get that food from, and how do we get it to our factories and to our consumers? And then the nutritional content of those products. So sustainability, environmental sustainability, and nutrition are absolutely 2 key pillars. And then the third being the communities that we operate in, and the communities being defined generally relatively broadly. Obviously, the workforce who works for the company, our consumers who buys the product, and then the actual physical communities in which we operate in, it just as a general framework. So this is new for us. I should also, again, I said I wouldn't promote my company, but I do think some context here is relevant. Danone, about 50 years ago, declared a dual purpose, and this was far ahead of its time of ESG. ESG, I don't think was a term then, but talking about the importance of doing well as a company, making money, but also doing well in society and in creating positive social impact. This is an evolution of those 50 years, frankly. We didn't have this chart. We didn't have this strategy attached to this chart even a year ago. So it's an evolution. These things should change in a couple of years. I'm sure we'll have something new in a way to refine and refocus how we're doing these various efforts. But for us, this is ESG in a nutshell. So the next place I want to go with this is corporate law. What is the corporate entity that can enact ESG frameworks and ESG strategies? I should say right off the bat, public benefit corporations. You don't have to be one to have an ESG strategy, but it's a relatively new corporate framework here in the United States. I couldn't get the exact number. It's been changing too fast. It's over 40 states now. I think it was 35 maybe a year or so ago. So states are passing laws to create these corporate entities that are frankly offered to anybody, whether you're a single owner enterprise or someone who intends to go public one day. You can create a public benefit corporation in the state of Delaware, which is where Danone North America is incorporated, like a lot of other large companies. And what this does in a nutshell, and this is probably there probably could be a proliferary of law reviews on this topic, and hopefully there will be, if not already. It really just lays out in the corporate papers what your broader purpose is for society beyond profit. So the idea in a term often used is stakeholder capitalism. And that term is used by many that don't necessarily have a public corporation that governs them. But again, public benefit corps are an opportunity to really codify for you, the business, in your corporate paperwork. And that, how enforceable that is, and how, obviously these are broad terms in those corporate papers. It's not getting to, granular issues of climate impact or nutritional impact or whatever it may be, but it does create a transparent, upfront way to tell the shareholders what the core purpose of this business is, in addition to making money. And that's really a fundamental step in a different direction than what we've known about corporations for probably hundreds of years, right? Where you have the shareholders have a fiduciary duty effectively to return profit. They still have that fiduciary duty, but tacked onto that is a broader social purpose embedded in these corporate papers. And I'd certainly be the first to suggest that, again, I think it's an evolution as to what this means in terms of real impact. But and I put JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon headline up there as an example, and I don't know if he still is, but at one point was head of the Business Roundtable, which if you don't know what that is, it's quite a large trade association of the top business leaders. And I think it was in the fall of 2019 that Jamie Dimon and the Business Roundtable made a really big splash with a statement at the time saying that stakeholder capitalism was the future. And that's my paraphrase. You can go back and find the exact words. But obviously, many of those companies, if not all of those companies, are probably not public benefit corporations. I haven't checked on every single one, so I'm not going to be declarative there. But the point being that there's kind of a couple things happening here in tandem or parallel to each other. One is just this concept that is actually part of the conversation amongst companies of all levels. Now, whether they're actually enacting it and what that means for them, that being a significant open question, but then parallel to that, we have real legal opportunities to codify that business in a different manner and perhaps set that business on a course to think more broadly. And then the one at the bottom, so Danone is actually, we're headquartered in Paris, France. We're a French company. I work for the US subsidiary Danone North America, which is a public benefit corp. But in France, they recently, this was I think 4 years ago, passed a statute to create and I'm not going to try and use a proper French pronunciation there, but an enterprise mission codification for businesses, which we became, I think, back in 2020. So that was a pretty big step for us as a multinational company headquartered in France. The next piece of this, and again, ESG frameworks do not need to necessarily be a public benefit corp. They do not need to be a certified B Corp. But this is another layer of governance, another layer of frameworks that are emerging and becoming a trend for many companies to consider embedding their ESG framework within, in this case, a voluntary set of rules. So if you don't know it, I encourage you to look at B-Lab. B-Lab is the organization that certifies companies as a third party to become a certified B Corp. So that logo that you see there on the slide is something that certified B Corps can use on their packaging, on their websites, and their materials to demonstrate that they actually have a third party certifying their efforts. And I actually did not scan the entire website and all the communication documents, but I don't believe B-Lab uses the term ESG. But I think many of the concepts and trends and thinking certainly has led to this idea of, again, stakeholder capitalism embedded in a framework from B-Lab. And so this is something that 20 years ago didn't exist. It's really been over the last decade that it's taken off as an option. You have to be read in the US, and I think whatever if there is a comparable corporate registration in other countries, because this is a global entity that does work, you have to be in the US, you have to be a public benefit corp to become B Corp certified. That's your prerequisite, that's your first step. But this is a really important effort, I think. Number one, there are leadership companies out there that have been leading the way on this for a good while now. Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's being two big names that you've certainly heard of, that I think were some of the first bigger companies that really moved this effort. You can go to their website and see there's over 6,000 companies, all sizes, from small to large. Multinational publicly traded companies are still a relatively small minority in this population of certified companies. But Danone and others, Natura is another. If you want to look them up, there are a couple others, and I apologize, I'm not going to try to do the whole list, but we're trying to create a template, trying to create a roadmap to encourage other large publicly traded companies to jump into the certification. It's not easy. It's very difficult. It takes a very concerted effort. I'll get to that in a second, but it's definitely a massive investment to go down this path. And why do we do it? There's many reasons, and I'm happy to talk more about what we think the full value is. But first and foremost, it's validation from somebody other than ourselves to say what it is we're doing, and hopefully that what it is we're doing has a more positive impact for society. The first two, 1 and 2, I think are critical here. What is B-Lab trying to do? What's their theory of change? Again, trying to push companies towards that's stakeholder capitalism model that actually pushes more than just a return on investment, but also a good for society in some form or fashion. So that's their theory of change. And to do that, they're creating a body of rules. They're creating a certification system. Every 3 years, we have to, any public or B Corp certified company has to re-engage with the process and get certified again. There's a scoring system. And one of the interesting things about it too, once you become B Corp certified, you're given areas of improvement to focus on. And so there's an expectation that with recertification 3 years down the road, there's some degree of improvements made. And this, of course, can get harder and harder. Danone North America, we're entering our third certification. There's new rules coming out in the next couple of years. This is a very fascinating process. And we are actually trying to get our entire multinational company B Corp certified by 2025, which again is pretty difficult. We have, I think, if I remember correctly, I should know this, roughly 50 subsidiaries across the world that we're trying to get certified. So it's quite an effort. This is just a quick summary of what the framework takes into account. Again, governance, and a quick example on governance, and I can go down each one of these. I'll probably just be super brief here, but just to give you a sample of how B-Lab assesses companies. Governance can mean a lot of things. What are the policies you have in place for diversity and ethics and anti-corruption and things of that nature. Also can take into account what's your incentive structure. Do executives have incentives to enact better sustainability outcomes or different social outcomes? Is the board engaged on your impact? There's a number of different factors that can come into play on governance, which is quite fascinating because companies, as you all know, can be structured in many, many different ways. Workforce, living wage. One of the really interesting things about Danone is that, I think we have 15 factories in the US. We are pro-union. We support unions and unionization across all our factories. And living wage is something we strive for. There's a number of different factors here that we try. It's important to our company. We think it's important for the business as a whole, but it's something that B Corp then can take into account, tell us where we can be better at, and then also, again, be that validator of what we're doing well or maybe what we're not doing well. Environment, there's no end to various environmental frameworks, climate being first and foremost, but as a food company, we're a user of water, we're a user of land with our farming suppliers. There's a number of different aspects that we try and take into account through our supply chain, not just our core manufacturing business. Again, community and so on. This is very thorough, I think is the simple way I'll leave it with you. And again, the rules continue to evolve. So we, like any rule system, whether it's government or a voluntary framework like this, us, the quasi-regulated community in this case, which obviously we voluntarily avail ourselves to, we do engage with the rulemaking, but at the end of the day, B-Lab is an independent body and they decide how they want to govern this community. Moving on from some of those examples of the Public Benefit Corp and B-Lab community, using climate change here as an example, and there's certainly others in the nutrition space, which I'm familiar with, and there's certainly various investor indexes and so on. But this is becoming more and more, from a global standpoint, the go-to voluntary governance for climate impact. And it's not what's, it's still a relatively new system. We have 3 independent non-governmental bodies that are creating these rules. I'll quickly roll through them, but bottom line, if you are a corporate entity who has availed themselves to do things at from a UN standpoint as a subnational level, we operate obviously across many countries. So this is outside the traditional UN framework. It's outside EPA or the US framework. And obviously in the US, we don't have a fully comprehensive climate policy. We have incentives, but we don't have a full regulatory system. So this becomes our de facto regulatory system in a manner that is really important for us as a company that has significant targets. Basically, if you're saying you can be carbon neutral, you can be net zero, you can be whatever % reduction you claim that you think you can make by whatever year, it probably behooves you to be in this governance. And we can debate that. We can debate whether this is a strong enough governance. We can debate whether it's going to move the needle enough. Those are all important questions, probably without solid answers. But from a corporate standpoint, I'd go so far as to say it's actually a liability at this point. If you're talking about, well, first of all, you should be talking about climate change. And if you are talking about climate change in real actions and goals and commitments, you should be in this governance. It's still relatively new. Companies are still in various points of the journey getting engaged. Greenhouse, in a nutshell, starting from the bottom up, greenhouse gas protocol, which has been around for some time, is your basic set of rules that determine how do you create your baseline? What's in scope for you as a company? There are primarily 3 scopes that are used for your greenhouse gas accounting. Scope 1 being the factories, the workforce, the immediate core of the business, whatever kind of business you are. So for Danone, it would be primarily the factories in which we make our food products. Or if we had a fleet, whatever assets we tangibly own and the emissions that come from those. Scope 2 is electricity use. So the electricity that we use or we purchase for our various operations. And then scope 3, which is the biggest for us, it's probably 90% of our full scope of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's true for a lot of companies, but especially in the food sector, is our suppliers, those who sell us ingredients, those who sell us the packaging materials, that actually allow us to put a food item out on the marketplace. Farming is the biggest part for us, the biggest part for, again, probably any food company, whether it's a grain or where we use a lot of dairy, so dairy farms, that all is a massive part of our overall scope, and it's what's called scope 3. Science-based targets is, I think, effectively only been around for approximately maybe 5 years now. We joined in 2019. We recently had our full scopes down to scope 3 which includes our agricultural systems, validated this past December. So it took us, and that's to a 1.5 degree warming target. So pretty ambitious target, and SBTI, the acronym that we like to use, that's the governance that, again, is validating that effort. CDP, the next one on the list, is what we send the numbers to. That's our reporting mechanism. And they're the ones that are looking at the quality of the effort at the end of the day. They do rate companies as well. You can go and see where Danone falls and where others fall in terms of their overall rating efforts. But these effectively are the global governances for climate efforts. Now, quick caveat there, and there's probably questions coming if you're not familiar with this. Obviously, if we're a regulated entity in a particular country, that can play into this overall governance, that those are greenhouse gas emission reductions or risk that we would certainly would be in scope. So this is not, I'm giving you all this just to tell you what's out there, number one, but number two, to say that government policies 100% play into this and are frankly needed and necessary to help drive the action within this framework. These are just frameworks that there's probably a really fun discussion to be had about why these exist. And, you know, they popped up post Paris Agreement 2015. For those of you who follow international climate discussions, and frankly was something to fill a gap where domestic sovereigns were not pushing new policy probably as fast as we needed. So it's a way to gather companies as a set of actors, and obviously much needed actors in this space. Moving along, I'll be very brief on this. This is just examples of other voluntary frameworks that are out there, and again, touch on the climate space in particular. A lot of controversy right now around carbon markets, credits, offsets, whatever it is you may want to call them. The Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative is something that recently just put a report out, and encourage you to read it if you're into this area, but talks more about what carbon credits should be used for and how and when. So quite an interesting piece there. The AAA framework is something put together by a number of environmental NGOs talking about, well, companies can't just talk about being net zero, but they also need to advocate for better policy at the governmental level. There's a lot I could say about that, but it's really a push to say, hey, the Danones of the world and others who are, hopefully everybody, again, should be making climate commitments, and climate action follows, but you need to be engaged also in the policy conversation in a positive manner. And then the bottom one is actually a new acronym, but it's a consolidation of efforts on the disclosure piece, which this will tie to some real law in just a minute. So just a quick overview of, again, kind of the space. At top, if you're following ESG efforts, if you're following any sort of sustainability efforts, greenwashing is in the headlines, and for good reason. There's a lot of questions about again, the durability, the realness, the additionality, whatever adjective you want to use. Is it authentic? Is it real? That these companies are doing. And if you're not in one of these frameworks, or if you're not being guided by some form of government policy, frankly, the greenwashing risk becomes greater. And what is greenwashing? Obviously, it's an effort to stamp out, words that aren't backed by real actions, I think is a simple way to think about it. And us as companies, we need to think about, again, how do we act in a way that has real impact, and then how do we communicate it in a clear manner that doesn't mislead anybody? So this is something, and I'll get to more government policy on this in a second. Just a quick, deforestation, a huge topic, again, one that's very difficult to track in a number of different reasons. But corporate actions are absolutely critical there. But again, what's real, what's not, can be a challenge. The bottom, just examples, and I should have been more clear on this. I didn't put these there to pick on those companies. Danone's being sued right now too, and I think any major company is probably engaged in some form of lawsuit. I also didn't put these there to give credibility to those lawsuits, to say that they are a good legal action. I just mere examples to demonstrate that there's an emerging risk, whether that lawsuit has real traction or not. Us companies need to be aware that more lawsuits are likely going to come, and a lot of it is coming from advocates who are trying to stamp out what they perceive as any lackluster efforts. And it's coming in a whole host of different ways. So this goes back to the previous slide, to the extent that companies can use standard bodies, can rely on government policies where available, it's really helpful to, again, drive real impact, but also minimize risk. Quick summary. There are certainly things I'm missing here on this slide, but I think these are some really interesting ones. A couple things. One, the SEC here in the U.S., Security Exchange Commission, is driving a significant rulemaking process right now that may get wrapped up in maybe end of this year or next, maybe, we'll see. And this would mandate public companies that are listed here in the United States to disclose their climate risk, and potentially disclose risk, the full scope of business, as I described under Science-Based Target Initiative, which could be their supply base as well. That is complicated, that is difficult to do, but it's where companies like Danone and those in Science-Based Target Initiative are already heading. But as you can imagine, this is not without controversy. There's a number of stakeholder groups who are concerned about this. And then there are corporates like Danone, and we have a comment that's public and you can check it out, but our support of this rule, not to say that every detail was something that we thought was perfect, but the general intent is good for harmonization alone. One of the things that we're concerned about is that we do think companies should be disclosing. We do think that transparency is good, but more and more in these ESG efforts, we have people measuring things differently. We have people disclosing things differently. And, I think we're all at risk having our integrity challenged, rightfully so, if we're communicating apples and oranges. So I think a large part of what the SEC, number one, we need to know that climate risk from a climate change standpoint, but number two, we need to have some real comparables out there as to what people are doing. And then, unless you've been sleeping and not paying attention, or you just don't like paying attention to government, we passed a pretty significant law here in the US about a year ago, actually, called the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and primarily a monetary incentive bill, right, for EVs, for the electricity sector, for carbon removals, for, there's a huge section for agriculture. The list goes on and on. One of the most significant pieces of legislation ever passed for climate change. But most of it's incentive-based or voluntary-based in many ways, not a lot of command and control, direct regulatory mechanisms in there, generally speaking. So what companies do with it will large part be guided by ESG strategies and then reported out potentially through ESG frameworks in a number of ways, which I find fascinating. So for us, again, as a food company, we are actually engaged in that lower corner, which is something separate from the IRA, but yet nonetheless very similar, called the Climate Smart Commodity Grant at USDA. And this was, I won't go into full detail unless you want to ask questions about it, but That is certainly a financial mechanism that we are leveraging with our resources and then putting more money to farms on the ground to enact various different projects to lower the carbon intensity of the commodities grown by those farms. So that's something that has been pushed and guided by certainly our ESG framework. We advocated for that policy, and now we are implementing with it, much like a energy developer would implement with a tax credit. So a lot of interesting stuff going on. I just picked a couple. Again, as a food company, I'm very focused on often what USDA has to say about things. And then coming down the pike, again, greenwashing is often governed by our FTC, trying to make sure that marketing claims are real and legitimate and substantiated. So there's a document called the Green Guide, which is currently in the process of being updated, where we'll see where it goes, but certain terms like carbon neutral, net zero could very well be included in that update as an example. I'm sure there's other things too, but just from a climate standpoint, those will be a couple. Regenerative agriculture, another fancy term that is being used by many, including myself and our company, but that could be something that the Green Guide in theory picks up on as well. So that is a key mechanism right there as a oversight mechanism or enforcement mechanism to put some guardrails perhaps on how companies communicate these efforts. I'm going to be very brief here. Again, I should have been more clear. I'm not trying to pick on any political party. I'm not trying to pick on any particular member of Congress, but I think, again, the facts are that the topic has gotten politicized over the last couple of years. There's many, many examples of it. I just picked a couple bigger headlines that, again, I'd be shocked if you haven't seen them one way or another. But really interesting, a lot of this started in the regulatory space. I don't want to say this was ground zero or anything like that, but I think it's a good example of it heating up politically. The Department of Labor issued a proposed regulation under the Trump administration. I believe it was 2020 or 2021. Excuse me, it had to be 2019 or 2020. And it basically was putting some limits on what retirement, what investors could invest in for the purpose of retirement accounts, more or less limiting ESG investment efforts for retirement accounts. Under the Biden administration, they went the other direction and clarified that in a positive statement that ESG factors were okay from a fiduciary duty standpoint. So kind of interesting there, just one little snapshot of the debate. But currently Congress is investigating through the House Oversight Committee. States are passing laws more than I can count or keep up with in a lot of different respects. And of course, one of our presidential nominees has been quite vocal about the anti-woke crowd and so on. So I won't go into it more than that. Again, just to state the obvious here that this has really ramped up in the public discussions. So what does that mean for a company like us? And I'll try and wrap it up here so we can get to some conversation. But first and foremost, I think this gets back to one of the first principles about what ESG is, or what good ESG is, perhaps, which is it has to be authentic, it has to be real, it has to be actually attributable and integrated into whatever your core business is. The Herb Institute at University of Michigan is doing some really interesting work right now under the banner of corporate political responsibility. That's something we're a member of, and in that discussion, trying to lay out some principles for companies to follow so that companies can be consistent, companies can be engaged, and companies can be authentic. There's a lot of examples in the public policy space where a company may say, yes, I'm pro climate change, but then be a part of a lobbying effort that pushes back on climate policy. That's been a very typical thing over the past few years. That can happen in many different areas. Again, I'm just using climate as an example, but the Herb Institute is really trying to lay out a framework for companies to be consistent, transparent, and authentic within the political sphere. Ceres is a nonprofit that has a business group. They do a lot of things with investors and a lot of things scoring companies, but one of their efforts is trying to bring companies to the public policy space to talk about better climate policy. And again, we're a member of that. And it's again, something where I think there's good transparency, there's good conversations to learn from each other. But it's, again, an example of ESG getting into the public policy space more and more. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and open. This is like I said, a very dynamic space. It's a lot of fun to be in, and I'll say this just as a quick conclusion. someone who worked in government for a number of years and has supported a lot of government regulation, this is not an either or. ESG efforts are great if they're real, if they're progressing, if they're contributing to the overall challenges in our society like climate change. In fact, I would argue that's one of the reasons I work at Danone. We need companies doing more, is my belief, but we also need government policy. It's not an either or, it's a both. And oftentimes one can inform the other and vice versa. So it's a very fun time to be working in this. And with that, Jenny, I'll bring it back to you and maybe we can chat a little bit. I'll stop sharing.
Super. Thank you so much, Chris. So for those of you who are watching, we do have time for a little bit of Q&A, and you can put your questions into the chat or the comment space on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get through as many as we can. And to kick things off, Chris, you talked about the FTC and its governance on truthfulness in advertising, and you referred to the Green Guide. Is that advisory?
That's a great question. So I'll speak from my company's perspective and the way we treat it. It gives parameters, so there's often some flexibility. It may not be 100% prescriptive on specific terms or specific topics, but we certainly use it as a clear set of rules that we want to be within whenever possible. If we're going to allow so we have multiple brands in our companies, and the marketers across those brands often want to say various things. And so we have an in-house attorney this is her specialty, this is what she does, and she wants to make sure that when we get into the sustainability space of environmental claims, what does the Green Guide say as one of the first places we go? So it's pretty important to us. Now, there may be some I think it is advisory by nature, but again, if you're marketing, you want to be within those sets of parameters. And if not, you need to be looking to some solid third-party substantiation for whatever it is you're trying to say.
If we have any students listening who haven't taken administrative law, I ask that because agency guidance can be helpful in terms of understanding how an agency interprets its own regulations, but it's not binding on regulated entities in the same way as regulations are.
Yeah, and you're going to stretch my knowledge of this a little bit, but I'll go so far as to say FTC is not like EPA, where there's a lot of policing going on. I think when things are brought to their attention, they can bring action. I don't know the agency that well, so I want to be a little careful here, but my assumption would be the enforcement and policing is probably not quite the same as, say, traditional environmental regulators.
In terms of like proactive enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, I think complaints can be filed, and I think, yeah, I'm going to stop there because you're going to stretch my knowledge of it. And I don't want to take anybody down the wrong path, but there certainly lawsuits and litigation can be brought on offenders, which again, whether you're right or wrong, you typically as a company don't want to fight that out in court. That's generally not a good thing. So you want to avoid that.
Okay. You talked about some kind of certifying bodies but I think a lot of what consumers want to know is how they can know whether companies are greenwashing and make informed decisions about where to invest. I remember speaking to a reporter last summer about a lawsuit in Europe, I'm forgetting the country now, that was against one of the airline companies out there, kind of diving into the way they talked about being a clean airline and how you could feel good about flying with them, and that was brought on behalf of consumers that felt that the advertising was dishonest. So what advice do you have for consumers who are trying to get to the bottom of that?
Very difficult to be a consumer in the space, without a doubt, let alone an investor. So going back to your Green Guide example, you could, in theory, be well within the Green Guide and not infringing on any part of that law, but at the same time, not be giving any clear signal to your consumer as to what you actually are impacting one way or another. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges, and again, as a food company, and I think, consumers get their information from websites, they get it from commercials, they get it from the actual package of the good that they're buying. So a lot of places consumers can get information. All of those venues arguably are pretty insufficient at the end of the day to get the full real story. I mean, we are challenged to getting the real story out on a package of yogurt, a yogurt cup. It's not a lot of space there to get the full piece out. How many can we try and have a good story and clear story on a website, but it is not easy to do. One of the things that, and this gets debated back and forth depending who you're talking to. So again, in the consumer goods section, and I think the analogy would be on an airline website when you're buying the ticket, what's the certifying body? What's the third party that can back up whatever it is they're saying? Now, not every consumer, think of B Corp is not well known by consumers. Admittedly, that's a whole bit of progress we'd like to make there, but think free trade, or if you think about the organic symbol, which is a pretty well-known food symbol or textile symbol in the agriculture space, consumers get confused as well by those various certifications as to what they mean. So all I'm saying, and sorry not to answer the question very well, is not a really great answer to educate consumers. So I think for us, we do it in as many different ways as we can, in many different formats as we can. We try and be consistent because repetition is usually a good thing. And then we try and have third parties support us in one way or another. So I think who's validating that company would be one of the first questions I would ask, and often I do as a consumer and look.
Yeah. When I'm trying to get to the bottom of that, I look to see how specific the sustainability plan is. When Amazon came out with its gigantic commitment, I went to their page to, I want to see numbers. I want to know if you're buying carbon offsets, exactly what they are and how those are overseen, because that can be a big red flag. So maybe we have a few minutes left. Maybe you could focus a little bit on carbon offsets and the role that you think they play in ESG and their pros and cons.
We could do a whole other hour on this. So I've had a lengthy career in this issue, just full disclosure. I was trying to legislate on the issue 15 years ago. Spent 2 years of my life trying to legislate on the issue, mostly unsuccessfully, had a few little wins here and there. Just to try, and what I was involved in then, this was 2009, 2010, primarily in the US Congress and with EPA and the Department of Agriculture, just drive investment to real carbon reductions wherever they may be, right? I mean, we're pretty desperate to get anything going in the land sector back then. I think the world, on one hand, the debate hasn't changed that much, but it has definitely escalated over the last decade plus. And what I mean by that is there's frankly not full faith and credit in what an offset is or what that carbon credit is, right? Who's the standard body that supports it? And there's a massive debate just within the climate finance community, let alone the average layperson who just wants to buy a product that's less carbon intense, about what's real, what's additional, what's durable, how long is that change? And especially in the land sector, land changes, right? Land changes all the time. Fires come through, different landowners come in. So the credibility around that investment is significantly under debate. It's not to say that good investments can't be made. It's not to say that good projects aren't out there, but as a whole, the market is divisive right now, to say the least, which is unfortunate because we need as much investment as we can get at the moment right now, given the climate crisis at hand. But there is not I think it's very safe to say there's not a solidified market of carbon credits out there in any sector. And the carbon credits I can go to a landfill and create a carbon credit. I can go to a forest and create a carbon credit. Some are easier to validate than others, just based on the nature of the project. But I'll give you an example. So Danone, I was a part of a team that we purchased carbon credits a couple of years ago. There were Nature Conservancy backed forest credits validated by Vera. I still to this day would maintain those were high value, high credible credits and high credible projects that had all the toughest rigor attached to them. We ultimately, and again, we still stand by that investment, number one, but number two, as a company, we are no longer at the moment looking at credits for the purposes of offsets. And primarily, there's risk, the PR risk. We don't, as a company, as a buyer or investor, we're the last person that should be being the backstop of credibility on that project. Someone else needs to be, right? Someone else needs to be that backstop of quality and integrity. And two, the Science-Based Target Initiative right now, and we've fully availed ourselves to this system, does not allow offsets to be used within your scopes 1, 2, and 3 for the purposes of reporting. So if we buy an offset, which we can, it will not be attributed to our climate progress under SBTI and at the CDP. Simple as that. So when you go to the CDP and you look at Danone actions, that will be that's our core business actions, not used through an offset.
Yeah, well, that's great to know. And for folks that are watching that are trying to be educated consumers about ESG, if what we've just been talking about, offsets and carbon credits, isn't something that you've dug into, I think if you're going to pick one thing to take away and try and learn more about, that's a big one, and there's plenty of information out
So
there.
I highly recommend, and I'm still digging through it myself, I haven't fully digested it, but that voluntary carbon market initiative is a good one to look at for they're not trying to get at the quality of the credit, they're trying to get at the use of the credit and the transparency around that use, which I do think is a needed discussion. So interesting.
Thank you, Chris. This has been really interesting and a very important topic. So we'll wrap up there. Just passing along a quick comment from the chat that this viewer is enjoying the talk very much. ESG is a huge movement in business. How to confirm the accuracy of ESG investing remains a question for me. So thank you to the audience for joining us. Our final week of talks will take place online next week. So we'll see you next Tuesday at 12 o'clock. Have a good day.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.